did you agree to serve on this advisory committee?
As the categories go, our institution is data curious, and we've been using the ATS data to learn more about our institution. In particular, we've been working with Chris Meinzer in terms of interpreting those data points for us to better understand our mission as well as our strengths and weaknesses. And in the midst of it, this request was made as we we're learning more about what ATS does for the individual institutions. And I was happy to serve in that capacity with the limited amount of knowledge and experience that I have, but it's been a delight thus far.
Well, Joel, what was very interesting to me was when we did our, I think we did a data visualization webinar, I think what it was. And we saw that you had several of your people on your administrative team attending at the same time. And so that was very impressive to us. And we realized, okay, there's at least some level of curiosity and maybe even some drivenness, right, in terms of data. So
we grew up at the Moneyball generation with the book and the movie. And we like to fancy ourselves as Moneyball wannabes as an institution. And all of us, as we sit and think about our institution's past and present and future, we wanted better basis for thinking through what we want to do and how we go about deciding these things. We recognize that data provides us with a picture of what is, but not why or what ought to be. But in order for us to get to what ought to be, we had to have a better handle on what's going on at the moment. And this has been very helpful to engage the data for that end.
I think for me, I was delighted to be asked to serve because I'm a big believer in ATS. Anything that I've been to, whether it's related to the economic challenges facing future ministers or the chaos group that gathers the chief academic officers, everything always has high quality. And so the programmatic function of ATS in terms of pulling peer schools together to learn with and from each other with wonderful input and guidance from ATS staff, the opportunity to serve ATS and to build some new relationships with leaders from peer schools was something that I will always say yes to if my schedule permits. So the fact that it was data oriented was just kind of icing on the cake in a way, because we have been in the midst of reaffirmation of accreditation. So for the last couple of years, we've been looking even more closely than ever at data and have been impressed with the volumes of data that are available to us through ATS. And so it was a way for me to reflect on how we have used that, but also how we have and continue to benefit from using that data.
Yeah, and I would echo Ken in the sense that we value the relationship with ATS. And it's interesting that coming into this role, there was very much a perception at our school that accreditation agencies of all kinds, there are several, were intrusive. And what we spent a lot of time early on trying to remind folks these are voluntary relationships. And yes, we're paying money, but why would you invite someone in, pay them to give you counsel, and then complain about the very counsel that they're giving you that you're paying them for? And so that was a real reorientation process. But I've both from ATS and regional accrediting and professional accrediting, I found overwhelmingly the counsel that we've gotten has been true. It's been helpful. It has been accurate. And so then echoing Joel as well, just the value of the content we try to use, and we're moving in the direction of using more of the IPPR and the SEER information and benchmarking and data collection. And so knowing when you're beginning to talk about those real important decisions, compensation, goal setting, doesn't it make sense to be part of the process that helps create the approach and the philosophy for the metrics that are feeding back to us, exactly how we're making those decisions. So, those are for us some of the reasons that it just made sense.
How do you and your school use data? And then kind of maybe start with which type of school is yours, in terms of that framework.
I think, thinking about data-free, data-curious, data-informed, or data-driven, it probably depends on the issue and the folks that are involved. And I think at any given time, we could be any number of those, depending on, I don't know if one captures our whole organization, but I can give a quick example of something that I think is a decision we made that indicates how we'd like to be collectively. That is high data informed, even closer to data driven. We switched our tuition model in the midst of COVID. We switched to just a recurrent $300 a month, more of a subscription tuition model. And so we, in the fall of 2020, we did a test run, and we presented to the board of trustees in early 2020. In the fall of 2020, we did a test run. Early 2021, we presented to the board of trustees, but we presented probably a 4 or 5 page proposal that was very much data informed, and I'd even say data driven. It included what would the implications be, headcount numbers, revenue projections, projected graduates, so making sure we took into account students that will be stepping out upon graduation, student loan data, percentage of students, and even in that discovery process, recognizing that as our enrollment projections, unfortunately, we've been following the enrollment projections, but as our enrollment has increased, as we projected, the percentage of student loan users has dropped significantly. However, the actual number has maintained pretty steady, but with rising enrollment, the percentage drops. And so the board, overwhelmingly, that represented the most comprehensive proposal of anything we put together. The board was really appreciative. It brought everybody in our executive team together, so it affirmed the seats we had at our executive team. And so a model using that, and that's allowed us to point and say, this is the kind of decision making that we want to do in development, in student life, in other areas. But that was really a positive thing, where data from all different sources, internal, external benchmarking, was able to pull together a proposal that the board found very helpful. Fortunately, they affirmed it, and the results have been positive.
That's fantastic. So you're not just you've given us an example, not just of how this happens, but that you're using that same model then in going with the intention of bringing it to all the different departments within the school. That's fantastic.
That's aspirational. We're working. I can say on the enrollment, we've definitely done that. In development and other areas, that's the model we're using. But at least it gives us an internal model that we know works in our context. But yeah, it's overstating to say that we're currently using it, but we're working to that end. Yes.
Great.
That example by Brent, fantastic. I mean, I'm learning just by hearing how you all managed the data and move forward in your institution as well. I guess the best way for us to describe where we are is we've been data curious for some time, often primarily for comparables, right? Whether it be pay, whether it be enrollment numbers, whether it be other areas in terms of fundraising, where we are able to ask the question, how are we doing in comparison to other institutions that are a like-to-like comparison? But the secondary thing that we've been engaged a lot more in recently has been trying to understand ourselves better. That is, not only asking the question, how are we in comparison to others, but also asking the question, what are the strengths and negatives or weaknesses we exhibit when we look at these numbers internally for ourselves, whether it be financial, enrollment, or otherwise, in terms of the process that's involved in terms of thinking through, these are areas of strength and mission focus for us. These are areas of weakness that we need to pay more attention to. And that data curiosity allows us to then narrow down areas where we want to dive in deeper, which allows us to say, then these are the areas that we want to tackle moving forward. It sets priorities for us in terms of where we want to be able to pay attention to. To give you one example, right before this meeting, the reason I was late was I was talking to a group of donors regarding the possibility of helping us in an area of need for us, which is about debt reduction for future students and also current students who are graduating. California is cost prohibitive for a lot of folks, in terms of their education as well as the cost of living. And one of the areas of focus for us has been the area of debt reduction for our students. And one of the things that ATS's most recent SIR did was to actually expand that section on debt. You might have noticed that in the most recent one that was sent out in March. It allows us to see with a 30,000-foot view where things are at. And I realize that these are minor things, but for us to place ourselves in a ranking situation, that is, one number we're looking at was 60% of our students from 2021 graduating class did not add a dollar during their seminary education. Now, that goes through some rankings in terms of where the numbers are, but for those who borrowed, they borrowed at the rate of about $35,000 in their 3 to 4 years while they're here. It allows us to be very specific in terms of both the strengths and weaknesses that we have, and then to prioritize where we want to place our attention, resources, as well as our ideas in terms of those areas that as staff and as administration, we want to move forward on. So we're somewhere between data curious and data informed and data driven. I don't think it's necessarily linear, as Brent pointed out, but somewhere all mixed together is our desire to understand our numbers better so that we can prioritize correctly and tackle those issues that are major first as we look at some of the institutional needs.
So I'm also very grateful for the conversation because I came in thinking that our school is data informed, and I still think that as a community. But depending upon the issue, some in our community are going to be data driven, especially if they have something to gain. If they can say that if we allow data to drive us, then we will get this or do this, or I will get this or do this. Whereas some may be a little more data free, depending upon how much they have at stake in the conversation. So I do think I want to watch for ways in which different subgroups in our community or individuals in our community think differently about data, depending upon the opportunity, the challenge, or the issue. But that said, I think as a whole, we tend to be data informed. And I want to use, because I'm seeing each of us wearing corrective lenses, I want to use the metaphor of lenses. I think data for us offer sets of lenses through which we can look at our own context, our own patterns, our own information, trends within ATS, trends within higher education in a way that provides more insight. And we don't only have one lens, but we have multiple lenses because that will help with our vision. I think we're data informed and not data driven because I think we are more driven by mission and vision than we are data. But data is still critical in terms of the lenses that provides as we think about mission, vision, context, and then we think about our strategic priorities as we live into our mission and live out our vision. I do think our use of data is in some ways to inform us so that we can improve whatever we have our eye on. So for example, that may be around recruitment, admissions, and retention. So one of the things that our faculty has decided we want to do in the next 5 years is to look at a disaggregation of that data in relation to gender, race, ethnicity, and so forth. So that we're not only looking at the whole group, but we're looking at subparts to see what we're learning about our system and what changes are needed to improve the ways in which we serve our students and therefore give them the best learning experience, educational experience possible. I do think in some ways that data plus our story helps us have a richer, more textured narrative. So I think about our institutional narrative, and it's more than a story. And if we're not careful, our narrative becomes a set of anecdotes. And I think, among other things, data can help us texture and enrich the quality of our narrative, even as we seek to learn. So in some ways, I think of how we use data. We use it internally. We do that to look at our own trends, for example, over a 5 or 10 year period, whatever the period of time would be. We use that data to look at some of our peer institutions, whether that's through the IPPR or other types of instrumentation. And then also, of course, at ATS more broadly, because I do think that internal small subset and then the whole set does help with the lenses through which we look at ourselves and our story. So I think data has helped us quite a bit. I think data has helped us as we think about the new ATS standards. We have been and are going through reaffirmation of accreditation this year. And so it's been very timely for us to take a fresh look and a deep look as we think about our institutional pulse and where we're strong and where we think we can improve and become even stronger.
Just in general, why do you believe data are important?
Data informs us, data points us, data helps us to highlight those areas of need and growth that we have, but it doesn't dictate where we go from this point on. However, oftentimes, as I've been leading the institution for the last 5 years, we make decisions without really knowing why we do what we do. I'm sure that's not the case for all the institutions, but we do this in our families. We do this in our local communities where we make decisions either because of certain history and tradition that we keep, or certain tendencies that we currently have in both staff and stakeholders that we have, or just a vague thought that this is likely going to work for us in our region at this time. Now, those are not unimportant things. The tradition or the composition of the group that we have and our desire in terms of what we want to do are all important. But this is where we are contextualizing what we do by adding yet one more layer for our discussion, for us to better understand where we've come, where we are, where we think we want to go. Again, data doesn't answer for us what we ought to do, but it better informs us to understand where we are now so that we can make decisions that are based upon certain history as well as decisions in the past that allows us to make decisions that hopefully will benefit the institution because we're better informed for it. I'm sure there are many other benefits as well, but at least for us, that's our base conviction in terms of engaging the data before us.
We spent recently at Weinbrenner, we spent a good bit of time over the last month or two trying to figure out if and how we could measure the impact of our graduates. And so we went through a variety, talked to some external groups, ended up talking about quantitative and qualitative data, and then ended up not securing an organization external that we were talking to. But what it did was it raised awareness, it invited multiple viewpoints, it uncovered things that we hadn't really thought about before, and ultimately it pushed us a little bit further toward fulfilling our mission. And I think about that because I'm with Ken and Joel as well, that my one concern with the data-free, data-curious, data-informed, and data-driven is to make sure that's not a hierarchy that assumes that data-driven is supreme, because I agree with what Ken said, it's mission, it's vision. But in the context, I think what data really does, it provides context, it provides levels of accountability, it aids decision-making. And when it's one piece of a larger conversation, it allows for some ways to evaluate, are we fulfilling our mission? How are we doing that? So I know in our context, it's really been helpful. And it was a missing piece several years ago, that just circulating different reports, both locally, accreditation-wise, trying to identify it. It started sloppy for us until you start to figure out what's actually helpful and useful. But always then, once people knew that the data, whether quantitative or qualitative, was invited, then it began to just, others began to circulate as well. So I think for us, it's really provided context and accountability and allowed us to move our mission forward.
So I think data may be important, but they may be useless. And sometimes that depends on how we have framed the questions, whether the constructs have a baseline of validity, whether we have identified possible bias. Because if we're asking questions that we want a preset answer to, then we probably have not constructed that question or set up that data collection very wisely. So I want to say data may be important, but I think there's certain conditions that need to be met. And that's where I think the clarity of why we're asking certain questions, why we're seeking certain information, what bias or what filters may be in there that may predispose the data that are presented, that may lead us down the wrong path or down a misinformed path. I think it's very important, because I think even though I may think, well, we're data informed, if we have bad information and a bad setup, then we're data misinformed. And that's where I want to be really careful about quality of data, because not all data has the same quality. So I want to look for something that has validity, whether that's construct validity, face validity, whether it's reliable data, reliable constructs. To me, that's crucial. Even there, it only goes so far, because I'll go back to my lenses metaphor. The lenses don't replace either the seer and the eyes with which the seer sees, or that which is observed or seen. But the data are powerful lenses, but you have the wrong prescription, you have the wrong lenses, and you're going to have a headache, or you're going to have an accident, or there's going to be a negative consequence because the lenses have not been what needs to be prescribed. We've got two campuses. We've got a campus in Richmond and Charlotte. We've got, a lot of stable enrollment on the Richmond campus. We have a lot of growth on the Charlotte campus. So it's a case where data are important to us as we're disaggregating not just students around gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera, but also to campuses, as we think about resourcing that will create an equitable set of access points for students on both campuses. So I think that's another case where data is important for us as we face some important decisions in the future, and do not want to just rely upon history or hunch, but we want something that has more quality and qualitative and quantitative, especially, information to that. So I think data may be important, but it depends on how we set all that up.
So little known fact is that we use our database to figure out who we're going to invite to participate in things. So if your faculty X is not on that list, they will never be part of the decision making on that. If your librarian is not listed there, then we will never get to that particular person. And then, of course, there's all the other sets of demographic information that we just, it just doesn't get it doesn't become part of the computation that we make, or the analysis that we do. What I heard you all saying is that the data, that maybe we can eventually get to a place where we're asking different kinds of questions of the data as well. That it's not just going to be about how many do we have of this and what did it look like over 30 years, but are those differences that we're seeing, are they truly differences, or is that, just kind of an artifact of having a ton of data? We might see kind of differences, but is that really a significant difference? Are there patterns of the ways that folks show up in the data? Can we predict certain things going into the future? It may not be 100%, but is there a way that we can, is there a way that we can find out who will grow? What segment is going to grow in this particular degree?
Yeah, I do think that, generating whatever tools that can generate quality data, for me, is an act of stewardship. And that, for me, is a very important theological concept, because I'm using data to plan for my retirement. I'm not just going to close my eyes and hunch my way into retirement. I want to have some projections and some plans and some strategies that help me move toward retirement no time soon. But you have to start early. Or if I'm thinking about funding a child's education or various things like that, we often use data in our personal lives because we know there's something at stake. And I think the same is true of theological education. So for me, it's a matter and function of stewardship. It's not just reading the numbers and trying to read the leaves. It's much more than that.
Is there anything else that you want to tell
us? I don't know exactly how this fits, and this has been an interesting exercise for us. As I indicated at the beginning, we've been meeting with Chris Meinzer. Now we've met him, I think, 3 times, with him 3 times. In fact, we have a scheduled meeting tomorrow in terms of the new SIRs and interpreting. And we started meeting with Chris at your recommendation, Debbie, in terms of the knowledge of the numbers before us. And where we've learned a lot is where we disagree with where the trends are. That is, if not only do we have a better understanding longitudinally or comparatively where things are at, Once we look at this data, it allows us to make decisions, even if it's contrarian, for a reason, and know that it's contrarian for a reason. To give you one example, one of the numbers that we looked at and puzzled over for some time is the median number of seminaries each prospective student applies to. And the median number is actually 1, which means that the biggest competition for applying to seminary is actually life, not another seminary overall. Or for that matter, the projection and trajectory of most schools going toward MA heavy versus MDiv heavy, which has been true for the last quarter of a century. Particularly, meanwhile, our school is 70% MDivs in terms of the composition, and our graduation rate is right around 3.9 years. Those are all unique features that are contrary to the trends that we see exhibited here. And these are where, as we were saying earlier, our self-understanding, our mission, and our decision-making about who we are and who we want to be gets reinforced, not because we're simply using data to make the decisions the same way others have, but if we're going to make a different decision and go contrary to where the trends are, it's a conscientious decision of mission and desire that allows us to say, hey, we did this not because we do not know where the trends are or the decisions are, but simply because we believe this to be the important priorities that we need to keep in mind in terms of what the institution does. And so in multiple ways, I think what ATS has done, and with this data in particular, it's been really helpful for institutions like ours to grow in our self-understanding. And I think that should be emphasized.
That's such an important piece, Joel, because what you're saying is that you're making decisions based upon the data, even though it may not be along with what the pattern is. Because again, going back to disaggregation, your particular brand of theological education and who you attract may not be the kind of the overall aggregate, right? I mean, Reformed or Presbyterian, or that group might be something that looks very different. Maybe the MDiv makes a lot more sense in that setting, et cetera. So looking at the aggregate, coming back down to kind of a disaggregated kind of subgroup within there, that's another important piece of the process.
And to pick up on the point that Joel shared about the median number of seminaries people apply to, I think in that case, Debbie, to your point about the Holy Spirit, that becomes a prophetic data point, because overwhelmingly what that means is most people apply to a seminary once, and most people have some kind of pre-existing relationship. And yet, countless times, and it was an ATS meeting just last week with other presidents and CEOs, somebody gave voice, and I'm not calling them out because it was their board of trustees, but they gave voice that their board of trustees said specifically they could collaborate with churches, but they couldn't collaborate with other seminaries. And that makes absolutely no sense. Why, if we're kingdom oriented and the data point's accurate, why aren't we working together? What it makes, and so so the competitive sense, people are not comparing our 3-4 schools and making a choice out of the best one based on tuition, curriculum, et cetera. They're picking one and they're applying to it. And yet we don't work together because so I think that's where data becomes prophetic in the sense, from ATS's standpoint, just stand up and knock it off. There is no evidence that people are applying to 4 schools. It's not a beauty contest and picking one. And so that's where I think the data points, but that could be a losing battle. And that's where I think people misapply. I love Michael Lewis, and Moneyball, the book's so much better than the movie, but they're both great. But his other works, The Big Short and others, but that's where using those people misapply. And then because the whole Oakland A's piece was competitive balance. We're not talking about competitive balance. You're talking about stewardship in a whole industry that is under attack by forces external. And so people misapply those analogies and end up just filling the competitive piece. And so anyway, I think that's where just that one point Joel shared. I think those are examples where the data becomes prophetic, because it just, you just want to look at school and say, knock it off, work together, serve students, and completely change your view because you're wrong. And here's the evidence.
I like that.
I want to throw out one more little thought here, because I first heard the language of aggregation and disaggregation in college. I was an economics major. So at that point, I was thinking law school, not ministry. So part of what I remember in terms of supply and demand, I apply now, because I think schools are either trying to figure out what to do with our supply and how to increase demand. So our data may help us think about the supply we have: libraries, learning resources, faculty, staff, financial aid, et cetera. But we're also trying to think about the demand of our context. So I kind of wonder, to what degree do we use data to refine our efficient use of supply? And to what degree do we use the data of culture to think about how to either speak to growing demand, or even speaking as a reformed person with a little Calvinism in me, to try to increase demand because we have empty seats to fill in a classroom, whether that's a virtual classroom or an in-person classroom. So I think in some ways we're working with, at our schools, not just our seminary here in Richmond and Charlotte, but we're trying to figure out the whole dimension of supply and demand and how do we think differently about that. So anyway, that's in my mind swirling as I think about these terms of aggregation and disaggregation, because I think a lot of us are aware that we have a treasure to share, and that in some ways, as part of our mission and vision, we would like to share this treasure we have with more people who want to learn and grow in faith and in their theological educational journey toward a vocation of whatever shape or form that may take. So for me, that's part of what our eyes are on when we look at data.
I'm so glad that I prompted this last part, because this is just so rich. I was surprised myself when we did the first educational models project several years ago, that I didn't see the competition that I was expecting between the schools. So at some level, the schools are not feeling competitive that way. I think it's maybe something that's kind of being infused from the outside boards, or, tend to be made up of folks who aren't part of the theological. I mean, for a good reason. It's by design. You want people from outside coming in. But what you're talking about, I mean, again, I'm hearing it from all of you, that maybe what we need to do is, so cut it out, to Brent, stop it, right? Stop that kind of competitive talk. Let's get together and figure out as an industry how we're going to show the value of this treasure that we have, right? Don't mean to use too much business language, but what's this? You will get a return on your investment. There is a value in this, in coming to theological education. Maybe we could just do it all together and find a way to promote the industry together. Thank you. I feel very much, I've learned so much from this conversation and from your contributions and what you've shared. Any last thoughts?
I learn every time I'm in an ATS conversation, as long as my ears are open, I'm not distracted. So Joel, Brent, Debbie, thank you.
Absolutely.
Feelings mutual. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the invitation.